Hi there, I posted on Facebook that my next project was going to be a copy of this gym top, basically because I want to test my binder and what sort of really good, strong stretch seams I can do that are going to be suitable for the gym. And I thought it'd be really interesting to share my experimentations with you as to different seam types. Now, I'm just going to be using, for this project, I've got this orange cotton lycra. It's 95% cotton and 5% lycra or elastane, and it's a fairly standard fibre mix for t-shirt fabric. And what I wanted to do is test the amount of stretch this fabric had, particularly down the selvage, because that's where my seams are going to be. So I wanted to know how much stretch I had in the fabric before I started, and then look at the different seams that we could do just on a domestic machine, if that's all that you've got, if you've just got a standard sewing machine, but also incorporating a little bit of overlocked seam, and if you're lucky enough, cover stitching, so we can see what sort of seams are going to give us the best stretch, how much restriction we're going to get with our seams, and also what sort of seams are going to give us the most kind of shop bought professional finish. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you a little guide that you can make up to test the stretch of your seams, and then I've made up some samples so we can measure them and see how much stretch they've got, and then see how they look when they're finished. So I'm going to swap over to my other camera and let's get started. So here's my little guide that I've made up to help us with the demonstration today. Obviously you could just use a ruler, but I've made up my little guide here to help us. And all I've done is mark it off in centimetres. So I've marked off from 0 to 10 in centimetres on the left-hand side here. And then on the right hand side, I've gone from 0 to 100 in percentages. So for every centimetre, that's another 10%. So I've gone from 10% here at 1 centimetre to 100% here at 10 centimetres. And I'm going to show you how we're going to measure our fabric using this little guide. So first off, so we've got a good comparison, I want to just use a piece of my fabric. And it's really important that we use the same direction of grain in our experiment all the way through. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm interested for this experiment in the stretch, not going round the body, going down the body, because that's where my seams are going to be. So what I want to do first is find my selvage, and this does curl a little bit, but this is my selvage edge. And I am going to fold my fabric double. So I'm not going to measure it right on the edge. I'm going to fold my fabric double and I'm going to measure it on this fold. So I'm going to put one end of my fabric on the nought here, and I'm going to pinch here at the 10 centimetre mark. So the distance between my thumbs now is 10 centimetres. And then I'm going to hold on the 0 here with my left hand, and I'm just going to pull across and see where I can comfortably get to. And I can comfortably get to the 40 here. I could stretch it out to 50, but the 40 seems much more reasonable. So I'm going to judge the lengthwise stretch of this fabric at 40%. And we're going to compare that 40% now with what happens when we put a line of stitching or a seam down that lengthwise grain. So let's just have a look at what happens. So I've got 4 seams for you here that I've sewn just on a normal domestic sewing machine. I've used a stretch needle size 11/75, and I have put my walking foot on the machine, but if you haven't got a walking foot, you could just relax your foot pressure just slightly, and that should hopefully give you the same result. So let's just have a look at what happens. So my first experiment, just put those ones out the way for a minute. My first seam is just using a normal polyester thread, a 2.5 stitch length, and I've used about a 1 centimetre seam, because actually that's what I've got on my pattern that I'm using to make my sports top. So I'm going to do that same process again. I'm going to hold the beginning of my seam on the 0, and then I'm going to pinch at the 10 mil, and I think I'll do it actually on the stitching, so I'm just going to move that up. So I've kind of pinched on the 10 centimetre mark, and then I'm going to pull with my right hand and see where I get to. And actually that is as far as I can get, and that's pulling quite hard. I can get to 20%. So if you remember, our original piece of fabric with no stitching in went to 40%. So actually using polyester thread and a straight stitch, that's reduced our lengthwise stretch in half, basically. So it does stretch, but it really has reduced it, and it's probably more than half, because 20% is a bit of a tug, actually. So that's our first experiment. I've then tried with the Gutermann stretch thread called Mariflex. So in this seam, exactly the same settings that I used for my first seam. So I've still got a 2.5 stitch length, I'm using the same needle, the same foot. All I've done is change my thread, and I've changed it for both the bobbin and the upper thread. And I'm just going to see what I get here. So again, I'm putting my seam on the 0. I'm going to hold it at the 10 centimetre mark, and I'm going to pull. And this time I can get to the 30%. So I've still got reduced stretch from where I started with no seam at all, but I have got 10% more stretch in, or 100% more stretch in this seam using the Mariflex thread than I had using the standard polyester thread, because I can get to 30% rather than the 20%. So that's those 2. So in my third example, I've used a zigzag stitch. Now most machines, as well as having a straight stitch, will have a zigzag stitch, even if they don't have anything else. So I've experimented with this. I've actually reduced the width setting to 0.5, and I have a 2 millimetre stitch length. So let's just have a little look at what happens with this. So I'm on the 0, I'm on the 10, and I'm going to pull that, and you can see I can easily get to my 40, or if I really pull, my 50% stretch. So actually, with that zigzag stitch, I actually haven't restricted the stretch of my fabric at all by using that and just a standard thread. So that might be a really good option. If we have a little look at how that looks when it's pulled tight here, I get a pretty good stitch. Now you do have to remember, if you're using that standard zigzag stitch, you want to have quite a narrow width setting on your zigzag, because if you don't, you'll just get little kind of gapy bits on your stitch. But because I've reduced that to 0.5, I get as good a stitch on that as I would, or a good a seam on that as I would on if I was using a straight stitch. So that is a really good option for keeping your maximum stretch and just using a very basic stitch and thread. So that's an option. And then finally, on some machines, you get what's called a lightning stitch or a stretch stitch, and it looks a bit like a bolt of lightning, which is why it's called a lightning stitch. It's like a slightly misformed or asymmetric zigzag stitch. Now the settings I've used for this are 1 on the width and 2.5 on the length. So if we just have a little look at that, I can get to 40%. Oh, sorry, something's just fallen down. I can get to 40% on that, but I can't stretch it out to the 50%. So actually, my zigzag stitch gives me the best stretch. This lightning stitch, in some instances, will be much better than the zigzag stitch, but on this particular fabric, the zigzag stitch is better. And just a word of warning with this lightning stitch, it can be really difficult to unpick. So if you make a mistake, it is really tricky to get out. So just be warned of that. So if we put those in order of stretch then, on this particular fabric, our zigzag stitch on a 0.5 for width and a 2 for length setting is the best. In the middle, we've got these two. So our straight stitch using the Mariflex thread or the lightning stitch give us about 30%. And then our ordinary straight stitch, sorry, I just need to move those across. Our ordinary straight stitch just gives us 20%. So if you've got a machine that actually only does straight stitch, this Mariflex thread is a really good option for you. So that's our basic seams covered. And now I'm just going to have a little look at what happens when we start using an overlocker or we start adding a cover stitch to our seams. So let's just have a little look at that. So first off here, I just wanted to have a look at an overlocked seam. So I've used the 4 thread option, which is 2 needles and obviously the upper and lower looper. As you can see here, I didn't have any big cobs of thread in exactly the same colour. So my looper threads are this kind of camely colour, and then I've got the matching orange thread for my needle threads. I found I had to increase my differential feed to 1.5 to get a nice flat seam. I left my tensions at the standard settings. And I adjusted my blade just a little bit to make sure that my seam was nice and flat. And obviously all machines, they all have their own personality, so I know they're all different. But the key thing is checking your differential feed so you get a nice flat seam. So let's just have a little look at what happens here. So I'm pinching my seam on the 10 centimetres here. And if I pull that out, look, I can pull that all the way out to the 50% mark here. So actually my overlocked seam hasn't taken away any of the stretch at all. And I have just used standard polyester threads. I haven't used any stretch threads at all. They're just standard polyester threads. And that gives me a really nice strong seam with all the stretch that I could want, and it's quite a nice neat little finish. Okay, so that's just sewing up my seams on the overlocker. Now when I had a look at my top that I'm copying, they'd actually used an overlocker to stitch the seams, but then they'd added a line of cover stitching as a decorative finish and actually to hold the seam flat. So I then looked at some options that I could use to mimic what's happening on this top. And this is what I came up with. If you've only got an overlocker and a domestic machine, which I know a lot of people will have, I feel very privileged that I've got a cover stitch machine, though not always privileged when it doesn't want to work for me, but that's another matter. So here I've done my overlock seam, exactly the same as this, and then on my domestic machine I have used a triple zigzag to stitch that seam down, okay? And then what I can do is have a little look at what the stretch is like here. So if I go north there, my sample's only just long enough here. I was running out of scraps of fabric. So that's my 10 centimetres, and I'm going to pull it, and actually I can just about get to 50 centimetres. So it might, using that row of zigzag, might have reduced the stretch just slightly, but really not very much. And that flatten my seam down so it doesn't rub when I'm wearing it. So actually that triple zigzag on top of the overlocking is a really good option if you've just got those two machines. And I actually don't think that looks too homemade to have that stitching there. Then what I did was I just had a little look at my cover stitch machine and what I could do on there. So the first sample I did with using just ordinary polyester thread. I haven't put any stretch thread on my cover stitch machine. I was using 2 needles, so you might be able to see I've got 2 rows of top stitching running parallel to one another on the top, and then the cover bit is actually underneath on this sample. So let's have a little look at what I get. And there I can get to 40%. So not the 50% that we could get to when there was no stitching, but I can easily get to 40% there with just standard stitching, and it just gives a really kind of neat finish. And then on this last sample, what I did was I had a look at what would happen if I put a kind of decorative line of cover stitching on the right side of my garment. So this time I flipped my fabric over so I have the wrong side facing up on my cover stitch machine. So the 2 lines of needle stitches are here holding my seam down, and this time I put a woolly nylon thread on my looper, which is a stretch thread, to give me this decorative finish. And we'll just have a look at where that gets us. And again, actually it hasn't made maybe a little bit of difference. I can get to about 45% stretch there, but actually it hasn't given me that much more stretch using the decorative or kind of softer woolly nylon thread than just using the standard. The only difference between these samples is I've flipped one over and I've changed the looper thread. So just to recap then, actually using our domestic machine, and you could try some other stitches and see what happens with them, the triple zigzag stitch keeps our stretch at 50%, and the cover stitch machine gives us about 40% stretch. If we just overlock our seam, we keep all of our stretch that's in the original fabric at 50%. Okay, so that is all of the samples that I've given you. So I hope you found that really useful and maybe given you some options that you might try when you're working with a cotton and lycra jersey mix. I'll let you know how I'm getting on with my top as I work through it and try and give you some other options for hems and for edge finishes and binding as I'm going. So there will be another 2 little videos hopefully to follow this one in due course. But for now, happy stitching, and I'll be back with you again soon.